Welcome to the Dairy News and Views podcast, a production of the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Dairy Team. Our podcast covers current educational, research, and industry tools available for your operation to manage healthy cows and calves while producing the highest quality dairy products.
Well, thanks for joining us today on Dairy News and Views from the ISU Dairy Team. I'm Larry Tranel, Dairy Field Specialist in Northeast and Southeast Iowa. Today, we're going to have a discussion with Jenn Bentley, our Northeast Iowa Dairy Field Specialist. So, Jenn, what are we going to talk about today?
Hi, Larry. Well, today's topic, we're going to talk about the buddy system, or what we call pair housing calves. So while we see many producers have transitioned to group housing, pair housing offers yet another way that producers may gain some benefits like group housing without having to make some major facility changes.
So, Jenn, I've been working in extension for 31, 32 years now, and I know that raising calves in individual hutches has always been the traditional or the accepted method, but still nearly 70% of our U.S. farms raise calves individually in some kind of way. So why the change now?
Yeah, that's true, Larry. We see raising calves individually. It does have its benefits because it's a really practical way that we can reduce disease transmission, and it just provides that individual calf care that those young animals need. But with that, that it comes with increased labor. So we see that raising baby calves on farms is probably one of the most labor-intense jobs on the farm. And so in the last few years, we've seen a shift towards group housing, and most of that is because of the automation type systems, the automatic calf feeders, and that's kind of been the major driver of that trend to go to group housing. But producers who have made that switch typically comment they don't really reduce the amount of labor, but it just changes the way that the labor is used. So it's maybe less physical labor, but yet they can still manage those calves with focusing on the health and management of those calves. So that being said, not all producers can make that change to automation or group housing, whether that's due to facilities or cost of the automation. And so in the last few years, there's been some more evident research showing that pair housing can be another benefit, and that producers can reap some of the same benefits as group housing, like health, growth, and social behavior. So, and a bonus for producers who don't want to make a major facility change, your hutches or pens can be retrofitted, and in some cases, no changes can be made to the milk delivery system. So you can leave everything else the same, but still allow for some pair housing.
So, Jenn, this seems like a great way for producers to try it out without investing a lot of money into a new system. So can you tell us something about some of the research behind this, and what does the current data tell us?
Sure, Larry. A lot of the research is still ongoing as we learn more about calf social behavior. I know we're starting to look more at cow behavior, but it's been really interesting to kind of look at the calf behavior as well and understand the health and management going into pair housing. So here's what we know right now. Paired housed calves actually do eat more, which is a good thing when we think about how calf starter is really a driver for rumen development and getting them to transition to the weaning process. So a study from University of British Columbia looked at the difference in starter intake and weight gain of calves that were individually housed or paired housed. And those paired housed calves were early paired or late paired at 6 days or 43 days. And all the calves were fed 8 liters of milk for the first 4 weeks of life. And then they started to step them down at 6 liters of milk. And then by the time that they were at the weaning process, they were reduced again by another 20% of milk. So by week 6, those early paired calves actually ate more calf starter compared to the individually and late paired calves. And so those intakes actually remained higher 2 weeks post-weaning, which becomes really important when we talk about transitioning those calves to the weaning stage. At those 2 weeks post-weaning, we typically see calves decline in weight gain because there's a lot of stress going on. So I think this is really an advantage to the health and growth of those animals during that time. It really allows for some additional growth, and we're not going to see that lag in those calves post-weaning like we typically do. The other study that we looked at was looking at the behavior of the weaning process. So typically when we wean calves, we see a lot of, or we hear a lot of vocalization, and that's kind of a sign of, they're in distress. We took away that milk, they have to learn how to eat more feed. But actually in this study, we learned that the calves that were pair housed actually had less vocalization through the weaning process than those individually housed calves.
So Jen, do you think that paired calves make them more adaptable to change? And, so I work with a lot of, producers in their milking facilities. What long-term effects could this have on our dairy cows?
Yeah, that's a great question, Larry. We kind of think of the short-term effects of those calves and the growth and health, but what does that really do long-term? Dr. Costa from the University of Kentucky actually did a review of some studies looking at, the behavior. So again, another study from University of British Columbia, they actually looked at the cognitive learning behavior. So essentially how well those calves were learning, either as individual calves or pair housed calves. And so they were given a learning test. So you can kind of think of it as a video game for calves and how well they learned or adapted to some of those changes. And so during the first phase, calves received a positive milk reward or a negative timeout based on the computer screen color. And in this phase, all the calves learned quickly which side to approach, and there was really no difference in the behavior. However, the true test was when we reversed that learning and the calves had to change their reward based on the different color of the screen. So when the test was reversed, the calves had to learn that rewards came from the opposite color. And so that's when we saw that pair housed calves actually learned and adapted better than those individually housed calves. And so we can take that to long term and realize that the impact of the calf's flexibility and adaptability can be long term when we think about cows being able to adapt to new diets or feedstuffs, changing groups within dry cows or moving into new milking pen housing. And Larry, you work with a lot of producers on milking systems. So, that ability of those cows to adapt to milking systems like parlor or robots becomes really important.
Yeah, Jen, so these all sound like some great benefits to the calf and even longer term to the cow. So what might be some challenges associated with pair housing that producers should be aware of before they would think about moving to this type of a system?
Yeah, there's definitely some unique challenges, just like any management system that we move to. We might notice more cross-sucking, and we have noticed that with automatic calf feeders as well, but that we have made some management changes to reduce some of that cross-sucking. So one solution for pair housed calving might be to use nipple feeders over buckets, because it's going to take those calves longer to consume that milk, and they're going to continue to suckle on the teat after finishing their milk rather than going to that calf and suckling on them. So I've seen some producers use the slow flow teats, and that allows for more suckling to occur at their own individual bottle versus going over to that other calf. It's also important that the calves feed at the same time. So as a guideline, you kind of use one muzzle width for two calves to eat side by side, so about 15 inches. So physical distance is needed even in calves too, Larry. So they also like to do what their peers are doing. So this kind of allows for them to see each other, but also get better performance within that feeding time. We also need to make sure that we provide adequate nutrition and greater amounts of milk. That's going to allow that calf to feel full for a longer duration and also help with the weaning process. If we can gradually stair step those calves down, it's going to help improve their calf starter intake prior to weaning. So producers should consider feeding at least 8 liters of milk a day or milk replacer and free access to water at all times. And we also want to make sure that those calves are healthy and have a strong suckling reflex. Sometimes we get some weak calves being born and they don't quite have that strong suckling reflex right away. So we don't want to put them into that situation where they're not strong enough to suckle, and then we have some competition with another calf. So just making sure that they're healthy and strong before we move them into some type of paired housing. Typically we see about a week age difference between the calves. That kind of keeps the body weight and body size pretty comparable with each other. And I guess with any management system, Larry, there is no one size fits all solution. So, following our best management practices in all areas of calf care are needed. So we need to get input from our herd veterinarian and make sure the people that are feeding those calves are okay with making the switch to paired housing, because if the people feeding those calves don't like this management style, this might not be their best route to go. And of course, our best management practices are colostrum management, housing and space requirements, bedding, and good sanitation protocols. And because if they're not all in place, this could lead to some unwanted calf issues.
So Jenn, all some great management tips to think about as producers consider this technology or this management practice of paired housing. So lastly, could you share how a producer might easily modify their current hutches to possibly accommodate paired housing?
Yeah, so I know, some producers, it requires some trial and error. It's not always going to work probably right the first time that you make the switch, but every farm's going to learn a little bit differently. But typically we see 2 individual hutches being modified. So we remove that barrier in between those 2 hutches, whether that's a panel or a wire fencing between those 2 pens, and adjoin them as one. So, we need to make sure that you're aware that calves might nestle together, particularly in the winter, in one pen or the other. So that may take more bedding on one side of the hutch or the other to keep those calves dry. So taking that into consideration. And then also ventilation. So, if those calves are going to share one hutch, we need to take into consideration good airflow within those hutches, opening up the side panels to allow that air to flow through. So currently, we still don't recommend using one hutch. I know that's been a question of producers. Well, if they're only going to use one side of the hut or use one hutch, why not just give them one hutch? But we still need to honor that space requirements of at least 35 square feet for those calves. So currently, recommendations are to still have those 2 individual hutches adjoined together. So I know there's some research coming down the pike from our neighboring universities looking at calf health and management within those pens and looking at pair housing. And I think as this becomes more common, we're going to be able to share more of that research data and some more practical management tips. But all in all, I think people or producers that manage calves in pair housing, they really enjoy watching their calves interact. They like to play. And even producers say that they've even expanded that play area because they really enjoy watching those calves, express that behavior that they typically wouldn't see in those individually housed pens. So I think all in all, producers have been happy with that switch, but again, that takes a lot of management considerations as well.
Well, Jenn, it's been a pleasure. Thanks again for updating us on another way that producers can manage their calves for greater health and growth and hopefully profitability as well. And if producers have questions on calf management in general, how can they get a hold of you?
Sure, Larry. I'd be happy to visit with producers on any concerns they have regarding calf management. I am based in the Winnesheek County office in Decorah, and I can be reached at 563-382-2949. And I'm also available via email at jbentley@iastate.edu. And just happy to visit with anybody on the phone, or, we do make quite a few farm visits looking at facilities and talking about changes on their farms. So definitely farm visits are a consideration because it's always easier to see those changes or see the facilities rather than, just on the phone as well. So I also do keep current on calf management practices and have many resources on our Extension Dairy Team website. And so you can Google the Iowa State Extension and Outreach Dairy Team Calves and Heifers, and there you'll find my resource page on a lot of different management tips on calf management. So thanks again, Larry, for having me on this episode.
Well, thanks for joining us today, and we look forward to visiting with you on our next Dairy News and Views from ISU Extension and Outreach. Good day.
This institution is an equal opportunity provider. For the full non-discrimination statement or combination inquiries, go to www.extension.iastate.edu/diversity/EXT.